The smoke had barely cleared from Chancellorsville when Robert E. Lee began to move. His men had pulled off the unthinkable, a stunning Confederate victory against superior Union numbers. But it came at a terrible price. Stonewall Jackson, Lee's right hand and the most gifted field commander of the South, was dead. Killed by friendly fire, buried with half the hope of the Confederacy. Yet Lee wasn't deterred. He had something more ambitious in mind. Something greater than defense, greater than survival. He would invade the North. The war had now raged for over 2 years, and though the Confederacy had fought ferociously, the tide of war seemed to be shifting. The Union blockade was strangling southern ports. Their rail lines were crumbling, and each Confederate victory was followed by deeper exhaustion. But Lee saw an opportunity. If he could strike deep into Pennsylvania, he might change everything. He could pressure northern politicians, demoralize the population, and perhaps force Abraham Lincoln to the negotiating table. A Confederate victory on northern soil could shatter the Union's will to fight. And so, in June 1863, Lee moved. 75,000 Confederate troops marched north through the Shenandoah Valley, past the ruins of Harper's Ferry, crossing the Potomac and entering Maryland, then Pennsylvania. Farmhouses were emptied, horses taken, bread ovens stripped bare. Civilians watched from behind doors as columns of gray uniforms moved past their fields, silent and endless. Lee's army was in high spirits. They believed they were invincible, but they were marching blind. Their cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, had gone off on a wide flanking ride chasing glory and disrupting Union lines, but failing to deliver the one thing Lee needed most: information. Lee didn't know the position of the Union Army. And worse, he didn't know that a new man now led it. On June 28th, just 3 days before the first shots at Gettysburg, General George Gordon Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac. He was quiet, reserved, a man who hated politics and disliked attention. But Meade was an engineer by training, and he understood terrain, movement, and logistics in a way few others did. He knew Lee was in Pennsylvania. He knew a collision was coming, and he intended to choose the ground on which it would be fought. Meanwhile, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a small crossroads town of no great military importance, shopkeepers opened their stores. Farmers fed their livestock. The daily churn of life moved undisturbed. They did not know that fate had marked their town for history. Gettysburg was a mapmaker's detail, but it sat at the junction of 10 roads, 10 arteries, all feeding into one place. To the generals, it was the key to movement. To the soldiers, it would become something else entirely. As June came to a close, Union cavalry under General John Buford entered the town. They didn't come looking for a fight. They came for high ground. Buford saw the ridges south of Gettysburg Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the long rocky slope of Little Round Top, and understood their value instantly. He positioned his men to screen the area, light resistance just in case. But what he did not yet know was that Confederate troops were already on their way. The collision would come on July 1st, but the story of Gettysburg had already begun. Not in gunfire, but in quiet footsteps across the hills, in whispers, in marching columns, in the long silence before history explodes. The morning of July 1st, 1863, was quiet. A light mist hung over the hills outside Gettysburg. The townspeople rose early, unaware that history was marching toward them from both directions. Union cavalry under General John Buford had reached the town first. His men were tired from the road, but Buford's eyes were sharp. He scanned the ridges south of Gettysburg and saw a defensive gift: Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, the ridge line leading to Little Round Top, high ground. It was terrain that could decide a battle before it began. Buford knew the Confederates were coming, but they wouldn't come all at once. They would arrive in pieces, division by division. He believed if he could delay them long enough, Union reinforcements could arrive and hold the ground. He positioned his cavalry dismounted, stretched across McPherson's Ridge and Seminary Ridge, using fences and stone walls as cover. The goal was not to win, but to stall, to buy time. At around 7:30 in the morning, the first shots cracked across the countryside. Confederate General Henry Heth had sent his division toward Gettysburg in search of shoes. What he found was a wall of resistance. Buford's men fired from behind cover, falling back slowly, making the Confederates fight for every inch. By mid-morning, Union infantry from the 1st Corps, led by General John Reynolds, began arriving on the field. Reynolds took immediate command and rushed his men into battle. The fight escalated rapidly. Smoke curled through the trees. Cannons roared across the hills. Then came a sudden loss. While directing troops into the fight, General Reynolds was struck by a bullet and killed instantly. One of the Union's finest commanders was gone before noon. But his men kept fighting. They pushed back against Heth's advance. More Union forces arrived from the 11th Corps. The Confederates responded with reinforcements of their own, and by early afternoon, the battle spread across the open fields and ridges west of town. The heat was punishing, the noise deafening. Soldiers fired blindly through smoke. Wounded men cried out beneath hoof and boot. Commanders shouted to be heard, their orders nearly drowned by the thunder of artillery. By late afternoon, the Union line began to falter. Confederate forces under General Jubal Early struck the Union right flank, exploiting gaps in the 11th Corps. The pressure was too much. Union soldiers retreated through the streets of Gettysburg. Civilians cowered in basements as bullets shattered windows and ricocheted off brick walls. The town itself became a battlefield. But the retreat was not a rout. The Union Army pulled back to Cemetery Hill, forming a new line on the high ground Buford had seen the day before. The Army of the Potomac now held the strongest position in the area. Meade had not chosen Gettysburg, but fate had given him the ground he needed. By nightfall, the town belonged to the Confederates, but the ridges south of it belonged to the Union. Lee had won the field, but Meade now held the advantage. 15,000 men had fallen in a single day, and the worst was still to come. The second day began with a strange silence. Mist drifted across the ridges, curling through the trees like smoke from a memory. The dead from the day before still lay in the fields. Some were barely cold, others moaned in pain. Medics and stretcher teams worked through the dawn, trying to save what they could. Both armies now faced each other in full. Nearly 170,000 men occupied the land around Gettysburg. It was the largest concentration of soldiers ever assembled on the North American continent. Union General George Meade had spent the night strengthening his position. His lines curved like a fishhook, anchored on Culp's Hill to the north, running along Cemetery Hill in the center, and stretching south to Cemetery Ridge, ending at the rocky heights of Little Round Top. He ordered entrenchments, artillery placements, infantry support lines. Meade understood that the ground was his advantage, and he meant to hold it. On the Confederate side, General Robert E. Lee was determined to finish what had begun. He believed the Union flanks were vulnerable. His plan was bold. He ordered General Richard Ewell to attack the Union right at Culp's Hill, while General James Longstreet would lead a major assault on the Union left. But coordination broke down from the start. Ewell delayed his attack. Longstreet disagreed with Lee's plan. He moved reluctantly, believing the Union line was too strong. Hours slipped by, and Meade used them well. By late afternoon, Longstreet finally moved. 12,000 Confederate troops emerged from the woods and advanced on the Union left. They struck at Devil's Den, a tangle of boulders and rocky ravines. They clashed in the peach orchard, where cannon fire tore through fruit trees and men alike. They stormed the wheat field, which would change hands 6 times in brutal combat. Blood soaked the grass. Smoke drifted so thick that men fired blindly into the haze. Orders were lost. Regiments became confused. Casualties mounted by the minute. Then came the fight for Little Round Top. At the far end of the Union line, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine held the extreme left. If they fell, the Confederate line could roll up the Union position from the flank. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry charged uphill. Chamberlain's men held the rocky slope, firing until their ammunition ran low. They fixed bayonets. The enemy charged again. Then came silence. Chamberlain made a desperate decision. He ordered a bayonet charge. His men swept down the hill in a wheeling motion, catching the Confederate line off guard. It worked. The attackers fell back. The left flank held. Meanwhile, on the Union right, Ewell's delayed attack finally began. But it was too late. Darkness was falling. The ground was treacherous. The Union troops held their positions on Culp's Hill despite the onslaught. When night came, both sides were staggering. The Confederates had taken ground, but not the advantage. They had failed to break the Union line. Lee's gamble had yielded only blood. Meade had held, but he knew the fight was not over. The next day, Lee would try again, and this time, he would strike directly at the center. Morning came on July 3rd with eerie calm. The armies had been fighting for 48 hours. Over 35,000 men were already dead, wounded, or missing. The heat had returned. The air stank of sweat, gunpowder, and decay. And still, the battle was not over. Robert E. Lee had a choice to make. His left had failed, his right had failed, but he believed the Union center might be vulnerable. If he could break through, the entire Union army could be split in two. He could drive them from the field and possibly win the war in a single stroke, Longstreet objected. He had opposed the plan the day before, and he opposed this one too. But Lee had made up his mind. The target was a low stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. It appeared thinly held, but appearances were deceiving. Behind that wall waited multiple layers of Union infantry and artillery, dug in and well supplied. Lee ordered a massive bombardment to soften the defenses. At 1 p.m., over 150 Confederate guns opened fire. The noise was deafening. Shells screamed overhead. Trees shattered. The ground trembled underfoot. Union guns responded in kind. The sky turned black with smoke. The bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours. When the cannons fell silent, an eerie stillness settled over the battlefield. Then, from the Confederate lines, 13,000 men began to move. They advanced in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, across nearly a mile of open ground. 3 divisions under Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. At the center, George Pickett's men marched with pride. Their line stretched wide like a gray ribbon moving across a green field. Union artillery waited. As the Confederates crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the sky opened. Shells tore through the ranks. Men fell in clusters. Flags dropped and were picked up again. Still, the line moved forward. They reached the fences at the base of the ridge, tore them down under fire, and began to climb. Union muskets opened fire in volleys. Still they came. Some reached the stone wall. Some climbed over it. For a brief, terrible moment, they broke through. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. Then came the collapse. Union reserves surged forward. The line was sealed. Confederate officers shouted, pleaded, tried to rally their men, but it was too late. The assault had failed. Of the 13,000 men who began the charge, over 7,000 were killed or wounded. Pickett's division was shattered. Lee's bold stroke had turned to disaster. He rode out to meet the survivors. His face was pale, his voice low. He told Pickett, "You must look to your division." Pickett replied, General Lee, I have no division." The next day, the Confederate Army began its retreat. Rain fell as they limped back toward Virginia. Wounded men filled the wagons. Thousands more lay in makeshift hospitals, their futures uncertain. Lee had lost the battle, and the Confederacy had lost the initiative. Gettysburg marked the high water mark of the South. They would never again threaten Northern territory on this scale. But the cost was staggering on both sides. Over 51,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. No other battle in American history would leave such a toll in such a short time. Months later, President Abraham Lincoln stood on that blood-soaked ground and delivered a few simple words. "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." He was wrong about the first part. We do remember. Because Gettysburg was more than just a turning point. It was where a nation nearly tore itself in two, and where it chose, with fire and sacrifice, to begin the long road toward becoming whole again.